All right, I am recording live with the returning Sapiens crew, or Yuval Harari crew. We've got Gonzalo with us and Josh Barrow. So, yeah, we're going to jump into section 3 of Sapiens here in just a minute. And yeah, this is a 4-part book. So, this particular part is it's a little straightforward, although definitely up for debate, because basically it just talks about one point, which is that humankind has unified throughout history, and it gives a lot of examples as to why. But before we get too deep into that, let's catch up with these guys real quick. Gonzalo, your mic's already off, so you want to tell us what's been going on with you and how you're doing or anything like that?
I don't know.
Just living life.
Yeah, going each day at a time.
All right, that's fine. Josh, what's new with you?
Well, I guess since we last talked, we finished a good experimental run at Jefferson National Laboratory in Newport News, Virginia.
Nice.
And so all of the data that I will be and others after me will be looking at for the next 5-ish years or so is now taken. So we can actually really start in on data analysis and getting some results out. And I guess the other news is in a roughly 4 weeks, 3 weeks, I'll be heading to Israel for several months. So
several months?
Yeah. So I'm going to work with my principal investigator over there in Tel Aviv University. So within earshot of our lovely Harari, yeah, who I think is at Hebrew University. But
that's right. Yeah, I was trying to remember which university teaches at in Israel, but okay, yeah, yeah. So we'll see if maybe we can. You gotta see if you can get him on the podcast while you're out there or something.
Yeah, I think he's a busy man, but
yeah, we'll see. When are you going, by the way?
I'm leaving March 15th.
Okay. Wow. Okay, that's coming up.
And then I'm back in May.
Okay, maybe we can do part 4 before. Otherwise, maybe we'll do it right after. But anyway, yeah, we'll jump into this. So I know we talked a little bit before we started recording. You guys did a little bit of brushing up on this section. And of course, we already did section 1, section 2. And like I just mentioned, we'll jump into section 4 and wrap it up next time. But yeah, is there anything you guys want to, anything that jumped out at you that you want to touch on or jump into? And anything in particular?
You go, Joshua.
Okay. I was trying to be quiet. I think I admit, as I admitted to to Isaac a little bit earlier, I haven't finished this entire section again. I read this years ago, of course, but in brushing up, I was very interested in this kind of, I guess in modern parlance, alternative history of empire, and how really what most people would call capitalism is very endemic within many cultures, and monetary system endemic within many cultures, and actually that being a unifying tendency rather than a disunifying tendency, or I guess what's the word?
Divisive, maybe.
Divisive tendency. Thank you. And that, of course, in the modern take of things is not the case. And I think this particular section lays a lot of the history down and really puts it in a nice kind of narrative way, in maybe a way that Thomas Sowell is not so good at,
Mm, yeah.
in things like Wealth, Poverty, and Politics,
Mhm,
or The Vision of the Anointed, something like that.
mhm.
But the thing that brought to mind for me, all this brought to mind for me, was uh, uh, the way in which we, I guess, think of money today as something that is empowering to the very few, and instead, historically, this tends to actually be empowering for the very few, but also the vast majority, in their ability to conduct themselves, conduct commerce, etc., at really a global scale, as Yuval Noah Harari points out, in the Afro-Asian conglomerate. And that, I think, is really interesting, because it's this supposedly divisive tool that actually has a really unifying case to make cross-culturally. And so he makes a case for things that are unifying in this way across a cultural divide. And ultimately, this leads to much more harmony in some respect, although that he points out, of course, that harmony is very delicate, very balanced at the moment and throughout most of history. And of course, is the driving force of empire and things like this. But I found it very compelling, his semi-alternative history.
Yeah. So you mentioned Thomas Sowell. I don't know if it was him who originally said this, or he was quoting someone else at somewhere, but that poverty is the norm and wealth is the exception. and I make that distinction because I don't know if Harari and some of his contemporaries would exactly agree. But the reason I mention that too is to the point that you're making. As capitalism or money and wealth increase, what happens is people are unified, but they're jealous of each other. And that's the divisive element. And yeah, wealth, poverty, politics, and there's a couple others by Thomas Sowell, even just basic economics, that lay these out really well. And I think those are some good ones to mention, only because, again, like we were saying before we started recording, that these little chapters can't get too detailed, because he's having to do what would normally take a whole big book in maybe one or two or 2.5 short chapters. But to kind of make the point, he makes the point that the humankind as a whole was originally divided. Like he uses a couple examples of like how that Tasmania and some other smaller cultures were isolated from the rest of the world up until a few hundred years ago. And there's some others that for thousands of years they were very isolated, and so they might as well have been on another planet, so they're very isolated. But over time they became unified with the rest of the world, and the first driving force in that was money and different forms of capitalism. And to use another Sowell sort of definition of capitalism, it's the dissemination of scarce resources with alternative uses. So technically, there's always been some kind of capitalism, but over time, especially exponentially increasing over time, up until the last few hundred years, capitalism has become more and more like we know it today, using these money systems and everything else. but the systems of money are what could originally unify us, because even if we're in different political systems, different belief systems in terms of our country, our king, our culture, our gods that we worship, whatever the case, different loyalties, even different language, we could go to a totally find a totally different stranger from a new land and say, you give me this, I give you this. So that's how money was the original and probably still the most powerful unifier of humanity. And he laid out some detail of that in one of the first sections, and then he goes into more detail of how empires did the same thing, but of course through military and political force. And then the section on religion was a little tricky, and I don't want to get too nitpicky on it, because that section is one where you'd have to really take about maybe 5 or 6 Iliada books to really properly lay it out, because otherwise it can come across as too deterministic. So religions and these ideologies, they appeared out of complex systems that emerged over time. They're like a product of emergence and a product of culture. He also makes the distinctions of how history and culture is a level 2 complex system or chaotic system. And he gives the example of how what is it? Like the weather is a level 1 chaotic system, meaning we can make sort of accurate predictions of the weather, at least within so many days, and even larger periods of time within a certain margin. And our predictions of the weather don't change the weather. However, when it comes to markets and culture and history and revolutions and these kind of things, if we would predict them, that would have an effect on them and change them, so it makes them unpredictable. Of course, we can predict a certain probability of things. Anyway, this is kind of like a big overview of the section, but he also gives some examples, such as how our cuisine or food over time had been from all over the world, but just adopted by certain cultures. And another example of our diversity and our and also our unification. Gonzalo, do you have the book, by the way, with you right now?
In Portuguese, but yeah.
Oh, you don't have the English one?
No. So I think it's a bit different.
Yeah, I was gonna. Josh just stepped away for a minute.
But do you want something particular?
Well, do you have a even the digital version of the English?
I can quickly find it.
Otherwise, I was just gonna maybe have you read like 2 or 3 paragraphs.
1 second.
Especially because you have that voice that somehow sounds to
You
me.
like it?
Well, for Harari, your voice sounds kind of like Harari.
1 second. I don't have the I'm sorry. I'm looking for it online.
It's okay. I can send you the couple paragraphs, I guess. Yeah, so what's interesting is I think there's these maybe about 3 or 4 paragraphs that kind of I think is the fulcrum of the book, or like the pivotal point of the book, where he's basically saying there's one thing above all that unifies humanity, which is or in particular sapiens, and he even mentions that in particular homo sapiens, and that that is the to paraphrase, it's that human beings have a certain awareness and a certain responsibility, so we place them at a certain what unifies culture throughout time, and especially in the modern era, is humanism. And you could, and even religious people, although they might put God above humans, still we have to use humans to communicate with God. So in this world, the responsibility and awareness of humans is sort of like the pinnacle that we have to protect and adhere to, and all those things.
Give me 1 second.
Yeah, if not, I can like send you these 2 or 3 paragraphs.
Can you?
Yeah. It's fine. I'll
I think I'm almost downloading
deal
it.
with some of
Okay.
this in post-production, because
Yeah, it's kind of bad.
it's fine. Josh had
That's
to step away and get a delivery, I
yeah.
guess.
I've downloaded it. Now, how can I see it? Can I read the EPUB in online?
Did you get it?
I have downloaded EPUB file of the book.
Do you have it? Are you ready?
No, but I can see. What application reads this? Open with.
Oh, that the software. I don't know. Did you take care of business, Josh?
I did.
Okay.
I have my sparkly water now.
Okay. Got your delivery and your water and everything. Oh yeah. Your water delivery thing. Okay, cool. So yeah, that's fine. I might do a little bit of editing, so no big deal. But
Sorry.
no worries. Yeah, so I was just saying how what kind of happened in these introductory sections to section 3, which is like we were saying, first money, then politics, then religion, although it's kind of hard to separate them. But the reason he separated them is because, and I think I was saying this as Josh had to step away, was that as even if people come together and they speak even different languages, and they have totally different beliefs and different political systems, they can still trade together. And so that's why it was money first, and then later empires conquered, and then lastly the world got unified in fewer religions being bigger and bigger. But then ultimately what he puts forth in sort of like the last section on religions is the sort of all-encompassing humanistic religions, or these three different types of humanism. And in this section too, he gets into the details of how there's, just like within maybe Christianity, where there's Catholicism and Protestantism and others and other versions of those, within humanism there's at least a few different versions of humanism, primarily three in particular, which is liberal humanism, which is an interesting one, especially in this day and age, because it's all about protecting the individual, and that each individual has some sort of a special portion of humanity that needs to be protected and needs to be honored and respected, and all those things that come along with human rights and individual sovereignty and all those things. Then the one that's like similar but kind of opposite at the same time, and this is what we run into a lot these days, especially when it's like people are calling themselves liberals, but really they are more like what he calls in this section socialist humanism, socialist humanist, I guess you'd say, which is to say that it's groups above individuals. So no individual is above groups, and it's all about equality and all those things. And then he also makes the distinction of the only type of humanism that has really distinguished itself from a sort of monotheistic philosophy, although they're not necessarily deist. Their philosophy is essentially monotheist, in that they have the philosophy that everyone is created equal before something, even, you know, the sort of atheists might call it the universe or the complex system of something. But the evolutionary humanist said that human nature is mutable, and it's something that can be either diminished to something almost animal-like. On the other hand, it can be something that evolves, and we can take part in helping to promote natural selection, or I guess that would be more like what do they call that? Unnatural selection, like they do with breeding animals. And that was the point, most famously, of the Nazi regime. And he makes also the point that what was it? Of course, Nazism and racism are very unpopular these days, but there's new forms of evolutionary humanism that have kind of sprung up almost as soon as Nazism and racism had become unpopular. And that's kind of like this futurism, transhumanism, and different forms of helping the species evolve. It's just now very unpopular to talk about genocide, of course, and those kind of horrible things. But there's still different forms of evolutionary humanism, which may be fine and okay, and something almost natural that happens, but it sort of competes to some degree with liberal humanism and even socialist humanism. So Gonzalo, did you find that thing that you can read in English? Otherwise,
Again, tell me which chapter, etc.
The chapter we're on, which is 10, I think, either 10 or 11. On mine, it's page 11.
Part 3.
Yeah, part 3, page
100.
page 20 or 228, the worship of man.
Yeah.
And it has this thing on it, this like Venn diagram thing.
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead. Now that you're with us and
I
reviewed and
don't.
everything.
Maybe it's my own inconsistent reading or my obsession with John McWhorter or something.
Mhm.
But I do not. I don't particularly understand the distinction that he tries to draw between um, what he would refer to as religion and I
Ideology.
guess ideology. If I don't think he actually uses that term though.
Mhm.
Um,
Mm.
anyway, and so the thing that made me interested in this is that in that Venn diagram is
Mhm. Oh, yeah.
communism, I believe.
Mhm.
And so communism is both a religion and a ideology, according to him.
Mhm.
But there are certain things that are purely one or the other. So I think Buddhism is not one of those or something. Or am I mixing that up in my head?
No, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity are religions along with communism, and I think he would put
Okay,
some others. There's another
sure. It's
sort
not
of,
an exhaustive list for sure.
yeah. There are
Um,
more on like a column chart thing on the
yeah,
next page or 2 pages later.
um, yeah. The thing that I read that section and I could
Mhm.
not, I guess, distinguish what he was discussing actually. And I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that. To me,
I I
D-
have a,
You go ahead, Gonzalo.
yeah. So I understand why Islam would be a belief in super order,
Mhm.
superhuman order. And
Mhm.
so basically, it's just opposing human norms and values and belief in superhuman order, and saying that Islam, Buddhism, communism is both. So what is
Mhm.
in communism? Where is this superhuman order at?
Oh,
Yeah.
it is the commune. It's the
tyranny of the proletariat.
the tyranny of the proletariat, and it's all of these it's to some degree it would be, well, they have certain venerated leaders that they put on almost a godlike status, not quite, although it's tricky because there's different kinds of communism, and some, like even North Korea, which is an interesting example because it's maybe the longest the longest running version of what they call officially communism, and they of course don't allow any other religion, but you have to think of the supreme leader as a deity, and you have to think of him as miraculous and all these things. They're not very coherent or consistent in how that they lay it out, but they do it in a more overt religious way, whereas maybe with Stalin and some other communists, it's just that there is this by superhuman, so like non-superhuman would just be like we're all people, and we're just regular people, so there's like nothing above us. But superhuman is that there is a higher order, and so I don't know, I think, yeah, technically he would put
This is where I have the problem with the distinction because
Mhm.
uh, I would argue that most modern
Mhm.
ideologies, at least the accepted ones,
Mhm.
are humanist in origin. And humanism, in even just a purely Renaissance sense, not an
Right.
Enlightenment sense, already venerated the the body and the mind in a way that did, in some respect, exalt it to something like spiritual or godlike status.
Mhm.
And you have this notion from Bastiat of um, natural law and the rest, and all of this is emblematic of some kind of hidden or slightly hidden from view, you know, clockwork to the way that we think that the human universe works.
Mhm.
And I personally think that this is quasi-religious, at least, and a lot
Yeah.
of the ideologies which get spun off from this, the worldviews which get spun off from this,
Mhm.
are political potentially, but they're still at their bedrock, I guess, have more of a religious tendency than one would be comfortable with if they actually got down to the axioms of it all.
Mhm.
Maybe I might be misinterpreting what he means about superhuman order. I know that doesn't mean the Ubermensch. I know that doesn't mean
I mean,
Superman or whatever.
I would
but-
just think of it as a higher power, so a power that is higher than you or me or us.
well,
And
what are human rights then?
yeah, that's a higher power.
What I mean, what
It's
are
a,
the
it's a, so he calls it a natural law religion, and human rights are within these natural laws that make up these different versions of humanism, a natural law religion, similar to how some of the Eastern religions, for example, or even Stoicism is sort of a natural law religion.
maybe
So I guess what he's saying, and I think in a minute we'll have Gonzalo read the like probably 3 paragraphs of that'll maybe help. But he does make, I think, a distinction here that this is something that he believes, or his theory, and he says if you're uncomfortable calling certain things like communism a religion, that's fine. You can go on calling them ideologies. Like everyone can agree that's an ideology, right? Or nearly everyone. Communism is an ideology. So is, you know, the various, or even humanism. It's maybe a little less agreed upon. I mean, a lot of people agree on it, but it's less. Like it doesn't have as much text that's like universally agreed by like a set of people, but it's more like norms and values that we have adopted. It's different from
I mean, there's the
communism.
law though, right? So
Yeah. But
that's a pretty wide body of text.
Right. So anyway, that's just saying that these are at least ideologies, though, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think everything is ideology, but it's tough for me to distinguish what is actually meant by higher power in some respect, I guess, because to me, reading people like Peterson, it's not easy to distinguish what that actually means in a not just in a technical sense, but in an existential sense of the way that one actually lives these things out and conceptualizes them in their own subjective experience. You're going to hierarchize and something above others. And this is roughly, if not phenomenologically, exactly equivalent to something that would be superhuman in scope. Whether that is embodied in a deity or not, I think is circumstantial. It's not necessarily the point.
So like, I think an example, I don't know if he uses exactly this way, but some of the more, I don't know if we can say primitive or ancient cultures, were most of their belief systems were animist, and even I would put in a similar category, even just like the more ancient European belief systems. I don't know if you'd call them animist, but you know, they're even in Asia too. They're just like they just give like general superstitious beliefs as to kind of like why the world is the way that it is. But it's not really, and it just kind of explains how and why that things are a bit, with animist and these superstition type of belief systems that maybe you could call those ideologies to some degree, but they don't have a superhuman or a higher power going on. They have powers, but not that are higher powers. It's sort of just recognize, if they did have a higher power, it would just be something like nature as such, or like the totality of reality or something. But it's, and I don't want to generalize too much, because there's probably some exceptions, but generally it's more of just like recognizing nature as such, and recognizing what's there, and kind of explaining what's there through stories and superstitions and animism and everything else. But they don't really have a superhuman, I mean, they might have some like supernatural things, but not superhuman. Like there's this God or this natural law or this right or principle that's above me or you or us. So there are some cultures, like in the book, he gives the example of like a, what is it? Football is a human. It has human norms and values, but no belief in a superhuman order. And there's some other examples like that. But I'm kind of using these other cultures with animism or just superstitious beliefs that don't have anything like superhuman.
Yeah, I guess it may just be semantics. I'm not sure, but to me, at least with my limited understanding of animist ideas, and having traveled in some animist cultures, my brief understanding of that was that effectively it is a supernatural, it is supposing a supernatural order, and in some respect it makes sense, right? Because
supernatural or superhuman? Like, is it a higher power?
I think if it is supernatural, it is superhuman. I don't know if it's superhuman, it is supernatural.
Right. I just mean that there's a lot of cultures that have had supernatural beliefs, but to say that there's a ghost doesn't necessarily mean that the ghost or whatever the supernatural thing is doesn't necessarily mean that it has like authority. It could just be like a thing that's there.
But I think that ignores at least the historicity of how animist thought starts, right? Which is primarily that you are in communion with something that can destroy you or can benefit you, right? So, you have a river god and you make sure that you conduct yourself well with this river god and try to appease them in some way in order to make sure that your homes don't get flooded out.
Yeah.
I mean, he selects very simple ideas in the animist notion of things, like with the white fox or something that shouldn't be hunted because this one time, it told the elder chieftain, chieftress, whatever, that you can find obsidian here. I think that was his example. And but that's a relatively inconsequential thing. There were much larger deities in this respect that maybe would be argued got rolled in later beyond animism into polytheism and then eventually into monotheism.
Right.
But as embodiments or secondary embodiments of a lot of the entities that were previously these animist things.
Right.
But to me, I think it presupposes that there is something that is superhuman and supernatural. I don't believe that, as I think I said earlier, if you have a supernatural, you have a superhuman, but I'm not sure that if you have just a superhuman that it is supernatural.
Well, right. Like, so the natural laws, like including many, well, Stoicism is a tough example because it's a little
Yeah,
bit.
I was intrigued by what you said that, because I didn't understand you there.
Oh, well,
I mean, I think that's
he gives that as an example in that,
of being superhuman or not superhuman.
well, that it's a natural law religion similar to some of the
Okay.
Eastern religions like Buddhism, and that there is a so basically what one of the points that he made, and maybe Gonzalo will read it in a couple of minutes, is how and he basically addresses Josh in these pages, I think, and he says, if you don't like this distinction, because basically he's saying some people like this distinction and some people don't, and if you're one of those people like Josh who doesn't like this distinction, he says, then you can just acknowledge that there are all these creeds throughout the world and throughout time, and many of them have developed into ideologies, and some ideologies have a supernatural and superhuman element, and some don't. So then the tricky thing about that is there's some, and this is the point that he makes, or distinction that he makes, is that there's some religions, like some in the east of perhaps Buddhism and perhaps Stoicism, but with both of those examples, it's a little tough because there's like different versions of them and different interpretations. But roughly, it's saying that they don't exactly posit a supernatural God, but they're still called a religion, but they're more of a natural law religion. And there's a few examples. He just lists like 2 or 3. And then
and I agree with those. I agree with those things. I guess it's an interesting delineation, and I don't know if as you said, I don't know if I agree with it entirely. I think all of them can be categorized in this way.
So you would just say that there are many ideologies, and some ideologies so you would just like, so on this like Venn diagram, would you just not?
I would just say there would be supernatural religions and there would be superhuman religions. But I think most of the things are actually some form of that. But I think it's just semantics,
right?
To be clear.
Mhm.
So I guess basically what you're saying is that there are like quasi religions. I think you said that might include things like communism, but they're quasi because they have a higher power, whether that's a natural law higher power or something along those lines, and but they don't have a supernatural element. So they're quasi.
I think if you're presupposing that there be some innate structure to reality that does not require some form of scientific or logical defense, that this is the way that things are and this is the way that things ought to be, that is an is-ought problem.
Yeah.
And that presupposition is dogmatic. And that to me is an echo of religion.
Right, which is
this is why I found your the Stoicism example interesting, because I may not have read enough Stoicism, but to me that is one of those ideologies, one of those philosophies, which does not, at least in my own experience with reading the limited amount I have that kind of quasi-religious echo, because it is a kind of highly logical mode of operation.
would you say it's a natural law ideology?
I don't know
Similar to
enough. I don't know
yeah,
enough. I don't think.
it's
I think we're getting a bit
it's
lost.
it's yeah, it's a little tough with some of these details because, like I said, with Stoicism, there's different interpretations. It's Stoicism is tough because especially modern Stoicism compared to the live Stoics in the, you know.
Sure. I mean, and you can
time.
take a more even tougher example, right? Like
Mm.
you can take Taoism.
Yeah.
You can argue that the Tao is a supernatural thing, or you can say no, you're taking
Is
things
it
apart.
superhuman or supernatural or both?
Everything.
I think yes. I think again, back to
Yeah.
my. I think if it's supernatural, it is superhuman. But
Well, well, see that's tough because the other thing that he was making a distinction is like the theory of relativity, and this is a little bit more in your wheelhouse as a physicist type person, is a belief in a superhuman order, but it does
yeah,
not posit necessarily human norms and values, and it's not supernatural.
I also disagree with that though, because
Okay.
we presuppose mathematical capabilities that can be used.
Can you rephrase that?
I think that I mean, the mathematics is a beautiful thing, and we don't understand why it is so applicable. And that is a human-derived method of describing and ascribing the dynamics and also kind of the meanings behind certain physical phenomena, respectively. And that to me is a little bit superhuman, almost to the point of I mean, Newton thought it was supernatural. So
yeah. And so some others did too.
The unreasonable, what I think Newton was the unreasonable reliability of unreasonable application of mathematics
for prediction.
Yeah, just I mean, you know, the thought experiments of Einstein really mean nothing in
the calculus.
Oh, I mean, and the calculus really means you can do all kinds of these theories in just a black box and they work.
Right.
The fact that they work in nature is actually you know, surprising. And you know, in Einstein's case, it was almost, you know, if you read his explanation of how he, you know, came up with the thought experiment that gave him the special theory of relativity. You know, it was a great thought experiment, but also it's a thought experiment. It doesn't mean that it actually would have worked. There are plenty of thought experiments that don't work.
Yeah, and I know there's some debate over what he meant when he said God doesn't play dice, but he's kind of getting he's not necessarily saying like Jehovah or something like that. He's saying the universe might seem random from certain points of analysis, but it actually has like an ordering principle to it, and that's sort of like the point of theories and physics.
The reason he said that was because he had difficulty understanding the implications of quantum mechanics, and I think more specifically the ideas of entanglement.
Quantum mechanics, right. Quantum mechanics, he had a lot of problems.
He was a fan of something called hidden variable theories, which basically was that no, there is actually variables that can describe what eventually we interpret as probability densities. That, you know, that nature is probabilistic is actually an outcome of something that is much more dynamical and classical at a base level. And that itself, that's a superhuman That's a
Right.
superhuman assumption, right? It's that I choose to believe that there is this underlying structure. And some people say that that's been disproven. Other people, like Sabina Hostenfelder, have pointed out the inconsistencies logically with that assertion that Bell's inequalities work that way. Anyway, the point is that you, in all those cases, you're talking about models, you're talking about structures, mathematical structures that have some kind of origin in humanity. They've been constructed by humans, but to presuppose that those structures are actually emblematic of the dynamics of nature, that is in some respects superhuman.
Well, yes. And I think what this gets into, this is a lot
Sorry
of
to completely derail this.
No. I actually think it's an important point that maybe Harari doesn't entirely get into, maybe because he's trying, you know, it's a history book and things like that. But I think it's important to get into, which is the idea that human beings are stuck with being human beings, and we don't know what we don't know by being human beings. And in being human beings, and not just human beings, but human being, like you know, that just sounds like, oh, it's this particular creature, but it's the particular creature that interprets reality the way we do with our brains and our culture and everything else that is us. And that puts a very so no matter what we do, when we try to figure things out, it's going to be very human centric, even in you know, positing a in any superhuman supernatural religion, there's still a it's very human centric. Even, you know, when we try to deal with the nature of atoms and photons and whatever else, we're dealing with the limitations of the human mind and the human brain, and we don't know what we're missing there. But to the point of this section is, I think he kind of like, and I might have said this while Josh had to step away for a minute, is that I think this is kind of like the fulcrum, or a pivotal point in this book, is where he's saying that overall we're all humanist, and we're all different types of humanist, and we've always been different types of humanist. He doesn't use these exact words, but it's all different types of humanism, and we're kind of stuck with that model because and there's going to always be different versions of it, like there always has been, but it's because we are the most aware and responsible and the most thing that has agency in reality that we know of. So it all comes down to humanism, but then there's all these different different versions of dealing with it, because within, and I think he gives this example early in this section of how some people don't like ideologies, and they don't like humanism, and they don't like all these things that he talks about in this chapter, because it's full of all of them are full of contradiction, including humanism, including liberal humanism, which seems to be kind of what he likes. They're full of contradictions, but the contradictions are kind of like the engines of progress, from overcoming human sacrifice to overcoming slavery to overcoming all of the contradictions over time. I mean, I think he gives also a little bit of examples of how we used to publicly execute people, because if you publicly execute people, you're showing how it is the state that matters, or the emperor or whatever, and that law, and not the humans. But now, even the worst criminal in the world, we will do our best to put them through a fair trial and all those things, because in some degree, and this is like this high level humanism that we've achieved at this point in history, but to some degree that that rights the wrong that was committed, and not necessarily by the person, but by society. We're righting the wrong that parts of humanity fail. So yeah, go ahead.
Yes, the idea of contradiction is very interesting. So so do you think, maybe you, Joshua, that you are from like a physics and mathematics background, right? So do you think that you can create a fully logical system without inconsistencies?
Been proven otherwise in at least one mathematical system. I'm not sure if it's. I'd have to brush up on girdle. To be clear, I've never been able to read girdle, but the interpretations of girdle. I think his proof is Girdle's incompleteness theorem is. I believe in any arithmetic system with symbols and with symbology, something like this. I'm not sure if it's been proven for other kinds of operations.
But I think that maybe the contradiction shows us the supernatural in the reality, so that you cannot create a isolated system and not have a contradiction inside it, because the only way to have a full system is to be reality itself, as big as reality. Do you like that, or understand?
No, I like that. Otherwise we would be Merovingian kings or something, right? Yeah, no, I do like that. I think what I would say is that yeah, we have all of our brains are in vats, and we all have our own interpretations of what's going on outside of our little vats in our heads.
Yeah.
And there are worldviews that get gradually filled through time, and axioms that get built up. And inevitably, those axioms are going to person be logically inconsistent. And so I think that's inevitable. The thing that I found most interesting about this chapter was that, with money, and then with the opiate. With what?
Oh, I said empires, but I guess you're going somewhere.
Yeah, empire. Yeah, and but it's not just empires; it's also the religious aspect, right? Because the opium of the masses seems to be very convincing. It's interesting that there's a couple of these abstractions which seem, at least cross-culturally, historically, to be consistent. Like the abstraction of money, right, is a weird thing, really. Like, it's a really freaking weird thing. Like, that why would for all of history we agree that, and we still agree that this represents some modicum of work, and that you are worth something like this that is actually made up of intangibles or actually technically worthless stuff, and we just ascribe it value, and that's
like a contract.
Well, that I mean, but that it is a contract. I agree, but it is weird to me that contract is cross-cultural historically, and that abstraction of the contract was universally accepted, independent of independent of the time or the place. Effectively, you could have Roman coins being used throughout the world, even outside of the Roman Empire, because they knew they were good for it. And I agree with Harari, where he talks about how there's a little bit of peer pressure effectively from one person to the next, right? Where it's like, if you value this thing, then eventually other people over here are going to start valuing this thing. So we can get gold from India and we can move it to the Mediterranean, and eventually, from just the way that the economic pressures work, the value is going to equalize, and then suddenly something that has always been valued over here is now equally valued over here, even though it had no origin. That value had no origin in this particular culture. It's a very interesting thing. And I guess that to me is something that I wouldn't expect, given kind of what Gonzalo was pointing to, like the subjective axiomatics of persons and smaller tribal collectives, and then eventually these kind of collectives interacting with each other. And then for some reason, there are these axioms that are actually shared somehow.
Well, I think of it as these are increasingly higher levels of abstraction that we've developed over time. So to some degree, you can see children, whether it's with their parents or with little children, with each other. They'll start doing trade right away. They can play the spoon game. They can do all these different kinds of trade and sharing. So it's
you just live in a capitalist
baby
society,
world,
and you have no idea what. Yeah.
Well, also there's a lot of examples in the animal kingdom. The animals do all kinds of trade. Not always a lot of physical goods, other than like sharing food and certain resources, but also they share grooming, and they share social trading, and all these different kinds of trade that's going on. But what makes money, especially to the point of this chapter, is non-money trade, even bartering, works in small groups, like probably up to somewhere in the Dunbar's number of 100-ish people, maybe 200 people in some cases. People can just trade with each other almost like ape troops. But when you get into bigger and bigger groups, and especially when you get into trading with outside of the groups, then you need this symbolic abstract representation. And that's just kind of what has happened. And then to Gonzalo's question, that's kind of interesting about the contradiction, and interesting to Girdle's incompleteness theorem, or Gödelian information, is one way to think of that, almost symbolically to the point of this section, is emotions. Emotions you can't compute, and the reason you can't compute them is because you can't, and they're full of inconsistency. And the reason is because you can't describe them, and as soon as you start to describe them, they become something else. So it's like if you look up, like if you try to like program love or anger, you kind of can, but as soon as you start to go off the description or the definition, it's not the actual thing that it originally was. And so then contradictions start to form. And this is why the humanities subjects and the liberal arts are such, is because or at least it's not this way so much anymore, but the whole point of the humanities up until the last decade, where now it's become a that's one area where you can really see something turning things into a religion, is is how a lot, not all the universities, but many of the universities are pushing certain ideologies, not the way that humanities are meant to be taught as helping you learn how to think, but telling you exactly what to think in terms of CRT and gender stuff and all of this. It's not like it's they're teaching it the way that catechisms and religion used to be taught in schools. It's now how certain political ideologies are being taught in universities and many high schools and even junior high and elementary schools. But what the humanities are supposed to be is they're supposed to help us deal with the contradictions and the inconsistencies, because humans are full of them, because we operate you can't have like closed systems. Like you can have a computer perhaps and a certain equations and certain isolated systems that are without contradictions, but when it comes to human culture, we're full of contradictions, and the reason is because the way that we actually operate, and this is I think a point that Harari didn't really make, but probably should have, is the way that we really operate isn't this, and I think I was saying this too before we started recording, is that he made this point that history is not deterministic, although sometimes people like to present it deterministically. And he kind of presented in the sections on politics and money and religion like it was sort of deterministic, but it's not. These are emergent properties out of the complex system that is human culture, and the way that we do that is through emotions, and we just do stuff like we're animals or children, and we just get used to things, and then we adopt certain things and we like them over time, and sometimes we can explain it rationally, but that's really like a post hoc rationalization. Other than that, there's just utility that has developed, and then that's where we start to run into almost like a superhuman order. It's like a superhuman order that helps us deal with all these contradictions, and that's what the humanism is. But what do you guys think? And then maybe we'll read a couple paragraphs and start to conclude, perhaps.
If I could, I would like to get your reaction on a phrase I thought when we were talking about this. So that the best model is no model. What does this remind you?
Is that something that came into your head, or like you heard that somewhere?
I might have. If I heard, I don't know. Maybe I did. I don't know.
Well, my first reaction to that is that nature is chaos, and then culture tries to take chaos or a world without order, a world without models, and give it order for purpose. So in particular, what we do as, and this is kind of like getting into like masculine, feminine, logos, eros, of like what we do is we take nature and we bend it to the will of humanity to make it more human centric and make it more, at least something that humans can survive and enjoy better, and maybe even things above that, whether we call that superhuman order or something. We take the orderless world and we order it for purposes, and then we're always having to update those models, and so without models, that's just like how nature is, although some people would say that nature has its own model, and we just don't like it very much because we want a better world with like air conditioning and good health, long life, and all those things that are very more human centric. But what do you think, Josh?
So I think maybe one way of what you're saying is models are human-made descriptions that approximate the world in some way. And if everything was perfect, we would have perfect understanding and we wouldn't need a model. Baudrillard talks about this a little bit, actually, in the opening to Simulacra and Simulation, where the metaphor is that man has devised a map that is so perfect that they can basically see all of the little things that you would have on a world scale, right? But of course, in order to make a map that detailed, what ends up happening is that the map actually is the same size of and actually enwraps the entire world. And the thing that Baudrillard says is that the map is the thing that has meaning for us. The world does not have meaning. We know how to interpret the map. We don't know how to interpret the world. So that's an interesting juxtaposition, I think, that it's the thing that we create in order to understand the world, but eventually in that case is as detailed as it holds more meaning for us. I think you can try to maybe come back to what Harari is saying, in that we have our own models in all of these little subcultures, but the thing that really matters is how they interact, and then the appropriation of certain values and certain structures across those cultures, making super cultures, mega cultures, etc., until there's some kind of a unification that takes place. He makes the distinction between people who were once on the Iberian Peninsula being ruled by the Romans and basically being genocided effectively, even by their own hands, and eventually some of their descendants being of Gaelic origin and taking the seat of the Roman Empire, taking the emperor. To me, the thing, I guess, that to draw back from your models and no models thing, and then Baudrillard's distinction, is that gradually, as we amass into a more unified state, we're getting a more and more detailed understanding of what it is that makes us human, makes us able to deal with one another, makes us able to call ourselves a universal collective. And a lot of the distinctions that previously mattered in those cases actually don't, because it's the software that matters, not the hardware. And I don't know if we'll ever actually progress to a world with no models, but I think that we can progress to a world with progressively better and better models, although that is going to be a very hard progression, and it's going to be probably exponentially harder as we get more and more complex. But I think that it is the model that matters. It's not actually the nature that holds the biggest meaning for us. That said, of course, as an experimentalist, it's nature that kicks back. The model never kicks back. So you have a way of self-correcting.
But does it kick you or does it kick the model? Or both?
Oh, it kicks the model, hopefully, unless you do something with a magnet improperly. But
okay.
But yeah, no, you have a very good way of assessing whether your model is correct or not, of how you interact with the magnetic field, maybe.
Okay.
Can I?
Well, just real quick on that, and then yeah, for sure. But another thing that comes to mind as Josh was saying that is another Thomas Sowell concept is he says there's no solutions, there's only trade-offs. And I think that's what happens
compared to what?
Well, yeah, but that's what happens in these models, is that they're always solving some problems and then creating other ones, or most of the time they will solve some problems and create other ones, and then we have to solve the new problems and create new ones, and then solve the new problems and create new ones. Um, that's actually what well, I won't go into the Dune examples right now, but I will say it does get into because yeah, Frank Herbert's really big on that, but it does get into I think our neurology, or our the way our brains are formed, which is something we mentioned a little bit earlier, because our brains are constantly modeling reality in the world. But what makes all of this pertinent to this section and humanism, and like a human-centric perspective, and maybe even a human-centric brain-centric perspective, is other animals, or most of the other animals, their neurology develops to do basically one niche within nature, other than like the real simple ones to survive. They have one basic niche within nature, then their brains just kind of like work for that reality. Whereas the human evolutionary niche is to go between niches, or like the nicheless niche, and so the way that we've done that evolutionarily, and this is kind of like what has given us such an advantage, and we probably learned a lot of this by like mimicking animals and a lot of different things throughout our history of a million years, or whatever, however you want to measure it, is we've gotten better and better for maybe all history, but especially in the more recent history, and especially humanity has gotten better at making models of reality and then constantly updating them. The only problem with that is we're stuck in that constant loop of having to constantly recreate our models, like Josh was saying, and we don't know what we don't know. It's like they say, and the last one I recorded with Ronald Sicro was talking about this, where the map is not the territory, but we often confuse the two. We usually confuse the two, and actually, he took it one step further, and that our model, the model of reality that we build with our brains and everything else, it's not the same as reality, but it's the reality that we have to live in, which is kind of what Josh was saying a little bit differently. But what were you going to say, Gonzalo?
Yeah, thanks. So your Joshua, your idea, blew my mind a little bit away. You said like something like the map holds more meaning than the territory when you try to model the reality totally. So, and for me, that previously when we were talking about the religions and that communism is in that sort of
Ideologies.
just a position of that model that
Superhuman.
yeah. I was thinking there's a distinction between idealistic and materialistic, and we can either go into the intellect or go into the body. Let's say go into like maybe I'm confusing stuff. I probably am.
Like matter versus abstraction, you mean?
Yeah, and
The materialist
is more
ways of understanding things versus idealistic or intellectual ways, perhaps, of understanding things. So understanding things, maybe an example would be understanding things through description, through language, versus tactile experience or motion, something like that.
And basically your comment describes something I'm afraid of, which is like not
Face your fears.
I love giving people nightmares, apparently.
Yeah.
yeah.
What's your nightmare?
I fear it in me, myself, and in the world, that we stop feeling, we stop being, we stop, and we hide ourselves in this very intellectual world, isolated and stagnant and shut down, right? And so, okay, I'll leave it where, right, where it
Are you
is.
talking about like if we get overly abstract, then we get like disassociated from our body and our emotion, or
Yeah,
is there another
maybe.
way you can maybe put that?
Um,
So I think maybe, there's a great book that I've mentioned it many times on here. I think Camille Paglia and Sexual Personae. And also, if you don't read that, then you should watch her discussion with Peterson. Basically, I think it's probably the best 2 hours of interview that I've ever seen, because they are just in sync with one another completely from entirely different perspectives. But Paglia basically argues that a lot of what happened with what we would think of as the modern Western tradition, starting with the literature of the Western tradition, but then progressing into the philosophy of the Western tradition, for instance, Descartes, is very it denies the usefulness and application of importance of the body. And
Is this because of dualism? I haven't read it yet.
It's related to that.
Is she saying basically that because we put a certain Western philosophy puts things in a spirit realm, the dualist perspective, then that's divorcing, or what it's doing, if I kind of understand this, is that it's abstracting out our emotions and saying they're spirit, where really they are part of the body. And I don't know if she has maybe that more materialist view.
Back even further than that.
Okay.
To the division between what we would think of as earth cult and sky cult. So, order 10,000 years ago, we had a very different system of more animist belief systems.
Mm-hmm.
We were animals embedded within nature. We were communing with nature in a way that was much more emblematic of what we would think of as a earth-centric cult. We had many female goddesses at that point. When we get into agriculture, Harari talks about this. We start, rather than living with the anima, we eliminate the anima or ascribe.
We take out of it what we can get out of it,
or we're bartering in a way. We're arguing with single gods of maybe a polytheistic system, that if I give you this, you will help me not commune with, but actually gain something from nature that will cost you as a god, but I will appease you in some way. And this is some of the notions of sacrifice, etc. And that's a very important moment for Paglia, because it's a moment of abstraction where we are less dependent on nature and our bodies and more dependent on our minds and the way of extrapolating, abstracting out some of the things that we would be otherwise responsible for. You can make an argument that capitalism is the greatest example of this, because what is capitalism except your ability to abstract away your responsibilities to the maximum number of capable persons in order that, you know, everyone become more productive. In other words, I'm contracting with you to do something that I would have to do myself. And I can maximize that, and I can maximize my productivity, and you can maximize your productivity if we have an infinite number of contracts. It's very similar. And so, you know, some people should take Marx seriously when he sees the kind of industrialization happening in the 1800s, and this thing that did have value, that was made by someone's hand, is now being infinitely copied and effectively at no cost. And so there's no reason for me to spend time and repair this thing when I can just basically get a new one for effectively no cost. And so
what in the plastic age?
Yeah, something like that. But I mean, there are echoes of that through throughout history. And I guess to Gonzalo's point, there's a certain level of abstraction that's required for that kind of understanding that is pretty much purely intellectual. And if it isn't realized at an intellectual level, it's at least at a subconscious level. You know, we don't necessarily have to go through all of the cultural dependencies of trade and things like that on a daily basis with people. There's a certain understanding there. But, you know, there's a very different kind of experience when it comes to embodying some kind of state, right? Like if you look at dance or music, it's a very different thing than the intellectual mode of abstracted understanding. So I think there's definitely something lacking in our map of the world, where that map is kind of at this point in time almost purely intellectual, right? I can go somewhere in the world and I can be there, or I can just go on Instagram and I can look at other people who have been there, and I can get sometimes an even bigger hit that way than spending the thousands of dollars maybe to go there, which is a beautiful thing and a terrible thing at the same time. So that's the abstracted versus the embodied. To your point originally, though, I don't think that we are necessarily absolutely losing something because of that. You know, I supposedly blew your mind and said that we care more about the map than the actual world, because in the end, it allows us to process more information in a way that is better for a larger number of people, and hopefully ourselves as well. It is at a cost, of course, or it's at a cost of experience.
Trade-off.
There's trade-offs. Yeah, exactly. I don't know if that answered your intimation or not.
Yeah. So can I?
You may.
So the whole book, *Sapiens*, is this contradiction between the intellect and being, or you know. So like people were primal. They were, let's say, animals. Then they had to derive ideas and create religion and societies and empires. So this is all in the mind, right? In the in the intellect.
The map.
It's all the map. It's the map.
The abstraction.
And so,
then it gets complicated, right? Because then you can have a map, or you can have a set of maps that are mutually exclusive and axiomatically intention, and they will motivate bodies into action. So then it's another game.
Well, because like sometimes Peterson gives this example talking about like Piaget and some others, which is he was the constructivist, but in terms of this abstraction idea, like be a good person is one of the highest level abstractions that we're all sort of like striving to and to some degree. But it's very abstract. Like, how do you be a good person? Well, the way that you be a good person is you have to do a lot of embodied things. And sometimes he'll give the example of like, okay, if a lady, Jane Smith or whatever, is a mother, then she has a child, and she's probably gonna have to play with the baby. And then she has another child that's maybe 5 or 6 years old, and they're gonna have to make dinner, and they're gonna have to like cook broccoli. But cook broccoli is not an abstraction. It's an actual thing that you do. You put water in a pan, and you put broccoli in a steamer or whatever, and all those things. And so you can make things really abstract, like be a good person, be a good mom, make a good dinner, spend a good time with your children or your family or whatever. And that can kind of be abstract, but then at some point it has to be embodied in the world in which we live. In action.
Otherwise, it's only a world of potential.
Yeah, Peter Pan.
But I don't know if you're trying to get at something deeper there, Gonzalo. But I agree with I think what Isaac said.
Okay. I was gonna add something.
You may.
Yeah. So when I think about, so in the previous discussions we had, we saw that in the empires people suffered. So basically we were happy, more or less happy, gathering fruits and berries in a very primal way.
I had problems with that, but
yeah.
I had very violent disagreements. People can go back and watch.
Let me get with that model for a bit, and then you can destroy the model.
Yeah. Thank you. It is a model. I'm glad that you realize it's a model.
Right.
And then we came to empires, and people basically, not slaves, but they had to work. They had like nobles that would
they had a lot of real slaves too, but yeah.
And so are we sacrificing the individual for the whole, or is this just a higher level of letting the individual? Because like if we didn't develop more into empires, the tribes in state tribes, others would become empires and kill us or enslave us. So we have to become empires, right? More or less. Let's let the model.
That's sort of an assumption that Harari was making.
Be simplistic.
I think that what Harari mentioned about, for instance, the epitomization of gold as currency is a good example, right? Because it's something that is worthless in one place that is worth something in another place, but eventually the values of that commodity equalizes over time as one establishes trade routes. Because if you have something that I want, I'm going to start asking you for it. I'm going to trade you things for it. And it's going to change the value of that commodity in one place as I get more of it and extract more of it. And then people go more into that business to extract value in that way as well. So, I think that your point about basically power vacuums in the absence of empire is apt in the same way, right? That there are certain systems of governance throughout history that become, at a very general level, necessary in order to survive as a collective. And that, of course, comes with its bad sides. But as he also points out, and this is why he doesn't really believe in the good guys and bad guys of history, as he says, it also comes with its good sides, you know, the ability to create wonderful things and establish norms and establish culture and art and all of these other things that in principle we wouldn't have much time for otherwise. You know, that's an historically empirical note. It doesn't mean that it would have to be that way. But that is the way that it seems to have developed. So, but I guess what's the question beyond just that survival instinct, effectively? Are you? I mean, like, I know that you started out with talking about the, you know, in primal cultures we were hunters and gatherers. And, yeah, I don't buy it.
That's
but
a model.
Yeah, that is a model. I mean,
it's an abstraction that says those people, the hunters and gatherers, were happy with most of their children dying.
Yeah,
and constantly running from predators.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
It's trade-offs, not solutions,
it's
but
all
trade-offs.
trade-offs. Yeah, and we made a
Yeah,
different trade-off when we discovered agriculture.
Yeah, it's
and
damned if you do, damned if you don't, right?
It's a trade-off.
yeah, I mean, yeah, I think trade-offs are all dams, right? Damning.
Well,
them.
yeah, like I was saying earlier, they solve some problems and they create new ones.
Yeah,
and I think that's what we're dealing with here. One thing that comes to mind in this inquiry is I think toward the end of this section, he is making this distinction that some people, I think he likes the theory of memetics, but he says if you don't like memetics, you know, like a meme theory, then post-modernity or postmodernism with, I think he says dialectics or some type of exchange. There's certain language for that that's basically the same thing, and it's basically the same thing as memetics, but just like a little different abstraction of the same theory. Then there's also what the social scientists use, game theory, which all of this is to say that we have cultural ideals and ideas and all these abstractions, which even if we're not always planning to have them as a superhuman order or whatever, these things like empires and everything else that you mentioned and we've talked about, they are certain ideas and probably especially religions and or you could maybe just group that all together as ideologies, including maybe even the ideology of money. They are memes or dialectical exchanges or games that give benefit to humanity, but sometimes will also sacrifice and harm humanity at the same time. And sometimes people will intentionally sacrifice themselves for this greater cause or this greater good, whether that's capitalism or communism or some religion or some other ideology. And I don't think I mentioned imperialism, which was what Gonzalo brought up, but the belief or one of the main beliefs with the imperialist ideology is that the bigger you are, the more that you and your people, the us versus them, will survive and conquer and all those things. And I think also in the probably the first section that we talked about and read, you know, he gives the example of how Homo sapiens probably eradicated at least the Neanderthals and maybe all of the other human species, and probably not, or at least theoretically not, because they were like individually smarter or individually stronger or better, but what seems to be the anthropological evidence in theory is that it's because Homo sapiens got better and better at connecting in larger and larger groups. And so that's what's kind of given us our dominance. So I don't know if that perspective to the book helps what you're getting at, Gonzalo, or what do you think?
I liked, I didn't understand bringing up postmodernism and dialectics and game theory. I didn't understand what
All semantics. That's the point.
Yeah,
it's just saying that it's different ways to say that culture is this thing of ideas or abstractions that sometimes it doesn't care about you, it cares about the idea or the abstraction.
so
And
ideas have you don't have ideas, something like that.
yeah, that's
Yes.
that's one way that Peterson and Jung and some others describe it. I mean, sometimes we could maybe say that we have
Dawkins is mind viruses, basically, is what.
Yeah, he's got the meme theory.
Yeah,
Richard Dawkins. But basically what he's saying is these abstractions, right? They have you, and they will at least once they get to this cultural level, which we're way beyond that, at least since we've moved beyond hunter-gatherer little tribes and villages. The abstractions are paramount. They are, and it's not just that they don't care about you and they're gonna discard you if you don't get on, but maybe what's bigger than that is people have seen and experienced and acted out over the millennia that if you adhere to these higher order abstractions, you will gain certain advantages. He gives like a certain little or some like little jokey examples, I think, in the early pages of this section, where he's like, you don't see it really in nature where they unite in these like worldwide organizations. It's a human thing. Like you don't see on a beehive that says like world worker bees of the world unite, and he gives a couple other animal examples like that. It's a human thing, and it's probably many would say, and probably even including Harari, is like that is the feature and the bug that has given us humans world dominance, is our culture that connects us in bigger and bigger groups. But what do you guys think? Do we want to read that 2 or 3 paragraphs, because I think that was okay. So Gonzalo, are you ready to read that 3 paragraphs at the beginning of, I think it's called Worship of Man? Just the first 3 paragraphs of that section.
The law of nature. No. Second.
I think that kind of like orders
The worship
things.
of man. The worship of man.
Just the first 3 paragraphs of that.
Okay. I'll start.
Yeah.
The worship of man. The last 300 years are often depicted as an age of growing secularism, in which religions have increasingly lost their importance. If we are talking about theist religions, this is largely correct. But if we take into consideration natural law religions, then modernity turns out to be an age of intense religious fervor, unparalleled missionary efforts, and the bloodiest wars of religion in history. The modern age has witnessed the rise of a number of new natural law religions, such as liberalism, communism, capitalism, nationalism, and Nazism. These creeds do not like to be called religions and refer to themselves as ideologies, but this is just a semantic exercise. If a religion is a system of human norms and values that is founded on belief in a superhuman order, then Soviet communism was no less a religion than Islam. Islam is, of course, different from communism because Islam sees the superhuman order governing the world as an edict of an omnipotent creator God, whereas Soviet communism did not believe in gods. But Buddhism too gives short shrift to gods, and yet we commonly classify it as a religion. Like Buddhists, communists believed in a superhuman order of natural and immutable laws that should guide human actions. Whereas Buddhists believe that the law of nature was discovered by Siddhartha Gautama. Communists believe that the law of nature was discovered by Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Okay. The similarity does not end there. Like other religions, communism too has its holy scripts and prophetic books, such as Marx's Das Kapital, which foretold that history would soon end with the inevitable victory of the proletariat. Yeah. Communism had its holiday and festivals, such as the 1st of May and the anniversary of the October Revolution. It had theologians adept at Marxist dialectics, and every unit in the Soviet army had a chaplain called a commissar, who monitored the piety of soldiers and officers. Communism had martyrs, holy wars, and heresies, such as Trotskyism. Soviet communism was a fanatical and missionary religion. A devout communist could not be a Christian or a Buddhist, and was expected to spread the gospel of Marx and Lenin, even at the price of his or her life. That is all, I think.
Just the not the one about the Venn diagram in bold, but the slash short paragraph on the next page.
Some readers may feel very uncomfortable with this line of reasoning. If it makes you feel better, you are free to go on calling communism an ideology rather than a religion. It makes no difference. We can divide creeds into God-centered religions and godless ideologies that claim to be based on natural laws. But then, to be consistent, we would need to catalog at least some Buddhist, Taoist, and Stoic sects as ideologies rather than religions. Conversely, we should note that belief in gods persists within many modern ideologies, and that some of them, most notably liberalism, makes little sense without this belief.
And he goes on to give more detail of exactly that. So I definitely recommend listeners or anyone like that. That's the main section where it's up for some debate, of course, but even if a person wants to hold to their belief, he offers a compromise. What do you think of that, Josh? Has it kind of like addressed those concerns you had earlier?
No, I think that we're in broad agreement there. It's the I guess the thing I was challenging earlier is the need for a Venn diagram of sorts.
Okay.
In some respect, I don't think he went far enough in the generalization of the classification of all of those ideologies as quasi-religious in nature. So that's my only qualm with it.
These definitional things, they're tough, but you could definitely say, I mean, it's just like you can say people in universities sometimes behave religiously. People, he gives the football example, but sometimes people with their sports, you at least say that they behave religiously, not that they necessarily have a religion or have a people that they or like entities or superhuman ordinances, but we often say that people in certain situations, and I think what it is, it's that sometimes I try to think of this distinction that there's nothing wrong with tribalism in general. The problem comes when, because you can get into a tribe of scientists and a tribe of just local people that do harmless things. The problem is when you attack and opposing tribes, and some of that can be okay in the abstract, but then it gets almost cult-like when you isolate those within the belief set. So basically it goes from tribalism to fundamentalism when a group almost violently, and this is kind of getting into some of the free speech issues that we're having in our modern era, where people might not be stabbing each other or shooting each other as much, although that's debatable. But even if they're not doing that, they're still tearing each other down, defaming each other, doxing each other, canceling each other. It's kind of getting into like cancel culture can be very fundamentalist or cult-like, even though it's in the name of some kind of humanism, probably socialist humanism or something along those lines. But yeah, do you guys have any other thoughts?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I think that although bubbles and basically information bubbles, how do you call them? When people isolate, yeah, okay.
Oh yeah, like siloing,
yeah,
echo chambers.
Yeah. So I think they are usually bad, but I think for a revolution, sometimes it's necessary for people to isolate, because if you're embedded in the matrix of society, let's say, or in the ideology, whatever, to get out of that ideology, you have to not listen and to have people around you so that you can I don't know, see the matrix by
see alternative abstractions.
Yeah, because when you're in the matrix, you don't. Let's say we live in the patriarchy, okay, and the only way for you to see
the only way to see it's a patriarchy is to go into a matriarchy.
No, it's to step away from it somehow.
Okay.
And I can give another examples, like if you want to, I don't know, imagine how it would be like to be the Black Rosa Parks or something.
Okay.
How do you have the courage to? I don't know if I'm saying anything that's.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
Okay.
You won't get canceled.
No. Meaning, I don't know if it's making sense, but let's see. How do you have the courage to do that? You have to kind of. I guess I don't know.
I think you're saying sometimes you have to go against the predominant ideology, and there's ways to go about that. But go ahead, Josh.
So I disagree with you in that revolutions require some kind of information bubble. I think there's well, maybe you can call them revolutions, but no revolutions are actually revolutions if they're not remembered. The only ones which are remembered are the ones that are in some capacity in opposition to the norm, but are also able to have dialogue with the norm.
Mm-hmm.
Which means, in other words, if you take the Rosa Parks example, there was a law, right? And she decided, well, it was the law was that if you're black and you're on the bus, you get to the back. I mean, that was, I don't know if it was actually a Jim Crow law, but it was definitely the norm that was expected of blacks at that time. And she decided to comport herself in opposition to that and did not go to the back of the bus when ordered. And so there are, I would say that if you have a successful revolution, it cannot be purely self-referential. It has to be outward facing and able to actually make sense in dynamic with the opposition, with the norm, right? You have to show people what it is that you're actually fighting for. You can't simply just have your own dialectic with yourselves and then call that a revolution if you're not able to actually interface with the broader consensus that is society.
So that's the contradiction.
Well, so real quick, I would say it's both, because like if you read, autobiographies of Martin Luther King Jr., for example, just to this civil rights revolution or example, it wouldn't work if they were only in their echo chamber, which that community, which included of course black people and other ethnicities that were supporting that movement. It wouldn't work if they were only in that echo chamber, but what made it work is they had an echo chamber to converse about it within themselves, that they exercise their free speech to talk about it in their meetings and everything else. But then they also found ways to and really what was revolutionary about and he and that whole movement actually related, Rosa Parks did it, and then that prompted this big bus boycott that was led by Martin Luther King Jr. But basically what happened was they found ways to nonviolent protest and nonviolent have that sort of dialogue or dialectic with the culture and the authorities. And what's interesting about nonviolent revolution is violent revolution doesn't, sometimes it's worked, but especially in modern culture, it doesn't work very well anymore. And so, but between, I think, I forget the name of the book that he read. There was one book that he read on a nonviolent revolution, but then also, of course, Gandhi was the originator of that, and sort of like the 20th century, which had a similar, actually Gandhi's story was about a train rather than a bus. But yeah, so it's, you could have your echo chambers, but then you also have, but you don't want to be super isolated. You want to have ways to then figure out how to, like they even had ways to strategically get arrested and all these different things to protest and have the dialogue and dialectic. So it's like tribes, but then tribes interacting with each other. And what's interesting there is that they found ways, because some in fact, the like Malcolm X, for example, is always debated, and some others that were sort of in that more violent ideology or at least culture, that said that they should protest with violence. Maybe, but probably because of the way that it was led non-violently, which is one of the things that they figured out in their little echo chamber and their books and everything else. Then they figured out how to have that dialogue with the authorities. But anyway, I don't know if this is helping to get at your inquiry.
And Zizek would say that the non-violence of Gandhi was the most violent action it could take.
There's a tendency among communists to redefine words to whatever they want them to mean. And,
yeah.
Anyway, yeah, I would. Slavoj Žižek is very interesting.
Yeah.
Very.
He's obviously eccentric and very fun.
Yeah.
And I don't understand why the hell he thinks he's a communist exactly, but
He said, I think he said it just to annoy people.
That's what he says, but it seems like he's almost like I think what he's trying to say is he's actually, and I don't agree with him, but or maybe on some things, but not in general. But what he's saying, I think his main argument that he's trying to do is say, you're like most communists, or even socialists, they're like socialism and communist just hasn't been done right before. That's why it always like got corrupted and fell apart and killed millions of people. And so what he tries to do largely, I think, is to say, here's all their good ideas and where they went wrong with their good ideas. And so let's do it right. Is kind of what he's trying to get at, but he's a complicated character. But what were you saying, Gonzalo? Or did
I think I finished.
okay.
Oh, you didn't have a question about Zizek? I thought you had a question about Zizek.
or something that he said. Oh, he said Gandhi's non-violent protest was the most violent protest.
Yeah. I guess that's not a question. That's just a statement. It's a little bit interesting, of course, but
well, I mean, okay, what's tricky about that is, and there's been a lot of this in recent years from all sides of talking about like what violence is. And I think there's an important distinction. This goes back, I forget all of the places, but it goes back to probably Aristotle and Plato. It goes back thousands of years anyway. The idea that there is different measures of force, and so we can negotiate, and then after we try to negotiate, then we can mediate with the government and legislation, and maybe have lawyers or courts involved. And if that doesn't work within our words, our abstractions, and if that doesn't work, or there's a breakdown there, and the government wants to impose its will or whatever, and sometimes it's person to person, like we have to maybe collect something that was stolen or get a just reconcile an injustice, then there is the physical force option. And if that doesn't work for some reason, you can't physically force a person and you can't mediate it through court and those abstractions, then the other option is through information, which is, and I forget, there might be some more details I'm leaving out, but the idea is that those who you can't force through courts and negotiation, you force through like police and military, and those who you can't do that, you're stuck having to deal with basically what we now know as cancel culture and defaming people, doxing people, all this that I think, I don't know if it's Aristotle or Plato, they call it excrement, like shit, basically. And that's where the comedians and the gestures and the tricksters come in, is they play with the excrement. Because if you can't force a person one way, you can force them, there's other options to force them. But that is to say, to this violence idea, is violence is physical, but there are different forms of force. And I think and some people like to conflate these other forms of force and maybe say that they're worse than physical violence or something like that. And maybe, but it's kind of like some of these other semantic arguments. They're not violence is violence, and then there's other forms of force that are non-violent forms of force, almost like non-violent protests that change the world, starting with Gandhi and some others.
I would say they're violent in different ways, in maybe higher level.
They're forceful in different ways, because they have power, and and to Slavoj Zizek's point, if Gandhi and you could even make the point that Gandhi and this might be a little touchy, but even Martin Luther King Jr., by giving their lives almost as martyrs, that that was the most forceful thing that they could do, because in doing so, then their idea became almost like a superhuman ordinance or something. Definitely became powerful and forceful by and that's because they were physically acted upon violence against that. And the subject of all the different kinds of martyrs throughout history, I mean, you can even look at along those same lines, Nelson Mandela, who wasn't killed, but he was put in jail for decades. Doing so, it brought more. What it does, though, is it kind of brings about this natural law, is that doing the right thing, when the authorities do the wrong thing, and that's made an example of somehow, that brings about the natural law, which really gets into our sort of humanism natural ideology, which is that humans are the pinnacle that we preserve and we look towards as something of equals and maybe created equal, those kind of things. But yeah, maybe some closing thoughts, guys, on this section, and then next time we'll get into the final section, the scientific revolution.
I mean, I think it was my favorite section thus far. Definitely the most abstract,
Yeah,
not embodied one.
Controversial a
little bit, yeah. I think the tendency to see in modern times history as this kind of one track thing, and that somehow things were always better in the past, and if we could only eliminate the empire or colonial or imperial tendencies,
or capitalism
and
monotheism,
if we could only eliminate all of the pagan tendencies and all these, or the monotheistic tendencies, that we would be better. And I think that the point that he makes is that these are structures that all lie at all of our feet, and we all are standing upon
shoulders of giants.
Well, I was going to say the corpses of millions. And that, the example that he of course gives is, the Roman emperors coming from conquered peoples eventually.
Right.
And I think that the point is that you can always look back in time, and the question is how far back do you look? And when do you stop and say, oh, that is what true moral being looks like? Or can we even do that? I would argue no. The progression of history is, not easy, and it's not clean. It's bloody and noisy and confusing and complex. The thing that I think that he draws from is that it does seem to be there is a unifying tendency, and there are psychotechnologies like money, like religion, that do seem to put us on some kind of a unification trajectory. And the thing which I don't think he goes into very much is how to derive what those important things are that we can maybe move toward in order to encourage that unification, or at least pacification through time.
Good stuff. Yeah. And any closing ideas, Gonzalo?
Yeah, so just to review kind of. So this part is the unification of humanity, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So myths, fictions, culture,
Mm,
money, empires, religion, memes brought us together,
mm.
right?
Yeah. Culture.
At a but there's also a lot of fighting because of these reasons. So that's the contradiction there. But I think globally, if things go well, it will unite us, not divide
Yeah.
us.
But I think that the answer, the question again is compared to what?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think his central point is that these psychotechnologies have actually been pacifying, not uh, they've been able to allow peoples to communicate and conduct business, conduct trade in a way that otherwise would have just been, stealing resources from one another just outright, just
Physically
via,
violent.
yeah, through physical violence.
For sure.
So, the abstraction of money, the psychotechnology of money, the psychotechnology of religion being something that can unify rather than divide, although not completely eliminate those divisions, of course, probably is a good thing. I mean, it's the same thing that he doesn't like playing the good guys and the bad guys through history, right? He looks at India and he sees the tendency of the tendencies of the British Empire to, destroy some Indians and also lift many out of poverty at the same time, not just with the trains, but with the legal system, etc. And of course, the person who was already mentioned, Gandhi, is an interesting case, right? So, someone who's educated in Britain predominantly considers himself part of British society and wants to be treated equally, and then is not, is kind of one of the moments that seems to baffle him into some kind of nonviolent radicalism, where he says, okay, if you don't want to play nice and you don't want to treat me the way that I know I should be treated as a human being, operating in this society which I've chosen to be a part of, then this is a case for independence. And then, of course, he talks about, Harari talks about, again, the Roman emperors. There's an example, I think, of Aurelius having some kind of dialogue with the senators about admitting 4 Iberian descendants into the Senate. And of course, he reminds them, like, I'm from Sicily, by the way, So there's that tendency for many people to care about hardware. But the point, I think, of unification is that it's not the hardware, it's the software that matters. So it's more how do we get the best software, and how do we encourage people to download it?
Good stuff. Yeah, I didn't know how much I wanted to get into modern politics, but maybe in closing, I'll just say that what was it? This situation in Eastern Europe right now, it's kind of interesting, Russia, Ukraine, because basically they're trying to act like they're willing to go to war. It's up for debate, but what they're actually probably doing is trying to get political brownie points in certain areas, because going to actual war is economically no longer feasible like it was just a decade or two ago. Now we're in a world where going to physical war is especially since the Vietnam War, but even the last few years, it's become the predominant idea that you lose political brownie points by physical war, and you gain it by avoiding that. So that's a good progression. But instead, we're sort of at mimetic war of some sort. We're at ideological wars, and those go all the way from the White House to Putin down to regular people like us, working out ideologies through interesting books like this. And the progress is that we don't have to have as much physical violence or as much. So it's good that certain things can be fought out in the idea space rather than having to kill each other, because even if there's a bad idea, as long as no one gets hurt, the bad idea can die, and then the people can live on to make a better idea, or at least a less bad idea. So yeah, it's progress, and progress is, it always comes, like we were saying earlier, at trade-offs with solving perhaps some problems and creating new ones. So there's no solutions really, there's just trade-offs.
So
yeah.
really quick though,
Yeah.
I want to get Gonzalo's
Yeah.
maybe rundown. I don't know how much you've been watching the news or anything, but
Sure.
the rumor on social media over here, especially from the more left-leaning types, is that all of this is a concoction of the US media. And
No,
what do you Europeans think?
no, it's not. So, at least in our media and our sources of information, Russia is putting troops near the border of.
Sure, but we do that with China when we play war games with South Korea.
Yeah, but they, like, I personally don't know if they actually want to go to war, or if it's just like some sort of game.
Yeah.
But it is scary. Like, Putin has a lot of power. So,
well, and I guess the blurb today is that he has said that something to the order of that Ukraine has always been Russian.
That's a Soviet mentality, like old.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah,
it's a Soviet abstraction.
So this is an interesting little tidbit, right? Because you were just going on about how we were de-escalating war to a war of ideas in some respect, right? This abstraction,
ideological warfare.
Yeah, and it's interesting because then it's like, what what are the limits of that? Can you just annex anything ideologically? Like, it's very interesting. I don't think that we've ever had something like that before.
Yeah, it's kind of new in history, because it wasn't that long ago where it still seems politically and economically benefit to engage in physical warfare. And it's the opposite in both areas now, especially also with physical technology, like well, it's physical technology of things like drones, and it's that we fight through information and even cyber warfare, but also because it's been like almost 40 years now, or at least 30 years, that we've known it's not just like Hiroshima was bad. It's the idea of nuclear winter and the end of humankind, and so that's why we are like even as much as we might still act like, oh, there's this and that Cold War going on, maybe like, yeah, sure, anybody could always like throw out a bomb or whatever, but and everybody, it's almost universally accepted, especially once a person gets like a little bit educated in terms of the possibility of nuclear winter and the extinction of humankind, that nukes are extremely unpopular, and those who talk about using them only gain any kind of political brownie points with the completely, totally uneducated. And then later, those uneducated people, if they gave them any political brownie points, they're like, oh, wait a second, that would eliminate humanity. Let me get those brownie points back. So yeah, we're in a state now where it's information war, it's ideological war, it's sometimes cyber war. The closest thing to physical war that we get, I mean, sure, there's terrorism here and there, that's real, but on the level of like modern Western countries, or we just say modern countries, including non-Western, like Russia and China, is drones. Although an emerging technology that is probably under discussed is AI fighter jets.
You think that's under discussed?
Well, I don't see it discussed very much in the mainstream media, I'll say. Probably with like people like nerds like us that run in certain circles that talk about nerdy things like that, it might be over discussed. But in the mainstream, people aren't appreciating that danger that it on one hand, it could solve some of the dangers that we have in terms of political or even like nuclear winter and those kind of things, if we're using AI and fighter jets and those kind of things. But on the other hand, it could create something as much or more apocalyptic. So this is how that we're always dealing with trade-offs and these responsibilities of our human creations, even in the abstractions. But yeah, any other closing ideas? Now that we've covered everything. All right.
Awesome.
All right. Yeah. Well, all right. I really appreciate it, guys. Yeah, we went a little over 2 hours, so good show. And yeah, we'll do it again, either hopefully before Josh's trip. If not, then we can maybe postpone it until like the summer, and we'll wrap it up. So appreciate it, guys, and I'll be in touch and talk to you guys later. Thanks a lot.